Welcome to the CEO of Destiny podcast, where you will find the tools to fulfill the purpose of your generation and wildly succeed in the marketplace. And now your host, Andre J. Benjamin.
Can you talk a little bit about the nation, how it's kind of moved away from, I know there's a lot of stats on small business and their impact on you. You cited the Kauffman Foundation, which is, very popular and doing a lot of research. As also SBA and various others. I'm all into the footnotes. I like the kind of that, nerd stuff. But for the podcast's sake, can you talk a little bit about some of those stats about the driver of small business on the economy, and then also how the nation has moved away from spending on innovation? There's not a lot given to a lot of research and development and innovation for children, like learning, and the nation focusing on that and looking at how to bring in, tremendous value. Can you talk a little on that?
Yeah, let's see. I think 40% of the GDP of the US is produced by small businesses. And
Wow.
that's a bit of an old number, right? Because one of the issues here is small businesses have been so underestimated that we're not even really measuring them very well. And we saw that during the pandemic. But that's data from about 2014. And still almost half of the employment in the country is small businesses, right? And I think the problem that the lack of recognition of that is currently driving a lot of the conversation in Washington, the mistaken conversation in Washington about why people don't want to work right now. And the fact that half of the economy is small businesses just isn't even entering into that conversation. So small businesses are just critical to the economy. Those are the numbers that reflect that, but the ways they are critical are that their births and deaths, so the number that start every year, replacing those that fail every year, they make our economy dynamic. And the American economy was uniquely dynamic in the 20th century. And that's also driven so much of the innovation in the country historically. And now maybe I'll turn it over to Seth to talk about the other fascinating piece of this question of how innovation happens, because it's not only small business. You need them in the economy making things dynamic, but you also need capital, especially very patient capital.
Yeah, really, if there's one key takeaway from the book, it's that capital matters. And I think that people don't always recognize what a struggle it is to find capital as a business owner. And the truth is that, and these stats I think are very surprising to most people, only about 1% of businesses take money from venture capital. So it's a big pile of money and it's really important, but it's a small number of businesses in the overall scheme of businesses that are being started. And I think this goes to this sort of question of like Silicon Valley taking over mind share. Again, that number kind of blows people away, but actually only about 17% of businesses take money from banks. And so the vast majority of businesses, 80+%, are figuring it out themselves, right? They're putting it on a credit card. They're using a home equity line. They're raising money from friends and family, or frankly, they're just starting their businesses with almost no money, right? With whatever they have in the bank. And as the nature and the types of people who are starting businesses has changed, we haven't done a good job of keeping up with how to funnel capital to these new builders. And so the result is that there are fewer businesses being started today than there should be because businesses simply lack the capital. And interestingly, we saw sort of almost like an unintended experiment around this in the last couple of months through the federal stimulus checks. There was an Upshot article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. It was asking the question, which of course is obvious, the answer to which is obvious to Elizabeth and to me, but it asked the question, are people taking stimulus checks and starting businesses, right? Is this uptick in new business starts, which really is this kind of a silver lining, if you will, of COVID, is the uptick due to the fact that people had stimulus checks. And by the way, these stimulus checks, obviously individually very impactful at $1,300, but from a business perspective, probably isn't what most people think of when they think of how much money does it take to start a business, but it just underscores the point that actually it doesn't always take that much money to get going. And the truth is, yes, people are taking their stimulus checks and starting businesses. Now, providing stimulus checks as a means for people starting businesses is a little bit like, drinking water by opening your mouth in a rainstorm, right? I mean, you do get some rain, right? You get some water, but it's not the most effective way to channel it to what it needs to be. And we talk a lot in the book about different avenues that we might take as a society, not always government, but it could be individual action as well, which we focus on quite a bit. But to help more new builders access more capital and access reasonable capital, which is not Silicon Valley style capital at millions of dollars, designed to find a couple of big businesses, and most of which fails, right? 66% of venture deals fail to return capital. By one estimate by Kauffman Foundation, 75% of venture funds don't return capital. It's not a very effective model for broad-based economic development. It works for certain funds, and I mean, obviously, it's worked for me for 20 years, but it's not effective from a broad-based perspective. What we need are what we call camels, which is a term we borrowed from one of our favorite entrepreneurs, Fred Swaniker, but they're not mythical. They contrast to the unicorns at Silicon Valley. They're not mythical. They're much more hardy. And they're the workhorses of the economy, and we need more of that. And to spawn more camels, we need tens of thousands of dollars on a per business basis, not millions and tens of millions of dollars. And I think that's a different mindset that we need to start thinking about.
It makes it very achievable and reachable for people when they can see it as, because most people who, as you talk about, if someone started, I love how you highlight some of these entrepreneurs, which I want to hear you kind of cover a few of them, but the idea that you always have to, it's even what was shown on television and whatnot, is you go to a bank. When you get an idea, you go to a bank, and the bank, shakes your hand and makes you jump through all these hoops, and they granted you the loan, and then you go out and you forge ahead, and then it just takes off. And the reality, when you gave the stat of people and the majority of people I know who started business, they didn't go to the bank. They took whatever they had that was in their disposal. They went to friends and family. I have a friend who went through, he first started on his own, out of his own capital, which wasn't much. Then he went to, he immediately got sales. Then he took that and went to, did a Kickstarter campaign to get some component of the, I think he needed some new equipment, got the equipment, scaled up more, and is continuing to scale up. And I know others I have another young man that is, that I've been working with for a few years and encouraging him to start his own business. And he has, and what he has done is he's in a trade and he's in a union, and he had worked to get in the union because he doesn't have a passion for it, but he knew he could take the capital from it, because he said, man, we work hard on those jobs. We work 13-hour shifts. We work long, and then sometimes we're off for a while. So he's been taking that capital, paying for all his permits, paid for a food scientist. He's developing his product. He's getting his labels done. He's taking this downtime that a lot of people could miss out on, and kind of look at it with if they buy into the disparaging narrative of, the future of you is decided by, and no disrespect, but because I have friends that are in the valley and whatnot, but by a bunch of nerds that are sitting around determining how the future is going to look. Oh, you're gonna sit at home and you're just gonna get a check, and the robots are going to do everything, and that's just, it's almost very dystopian. So this idea of you becoming a camel, there's the idea of actually taking. You talked about the power of agency. It's very huge. I want to talk a little bit about media and its impact on this narrative. I love how you guys highlighted about how the shows and the movies. This is very important because my children and I, my wife and of course with our children, we have an ongoing dialogue. The two oldest, who are 11 and 8, I noticed that at one point all the shows they watched portrayed all the business owners as villains. And I don't know if you guys have ever noticed that, but it would always be when they're introed on the show, they would scale up to a high rise,
Right.
skyscraper, and then they're in there plotting whether they're a fashion company. The fashion doesn't care about everything. They just care about making money. Or if they are in food, they just care about pillaging all the. It just became reoccurring, and so they said, "Dad, that's not true." Then they started to notice it, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, as well as when you talk about shows that when I grew up in the 80s. I was born in the late 70s, and shows that I watched, the Cosby Show, both parents were almost entrepreneurial. The Three's Company, Jack's Bistro, I don't know if you guys remember that, right? But he aspired.
He was a restaurant owner, but that's
Yes, he wanted to small business. He wanted so hard to. That's what he really wanted to do without all the goofing around. He wanted to run his own restaurant. That's what. And then Magnum PI, you guys highlighted the Jeffersons, even Sanford and Son. I guess he was running a junkyard. But just this idea that this is the more realistic driver that people can relate to. So can you talk a little bit about media's impact and kind of the storytelling that you see, and what you feel is being seen, and also what you feel is underrepresented?
Yeah, so this is like, my life's work, right? Is it being a storyteller? And so I can tell you that the mainstream media, quote, I mean, if you think about who the mainstream media is, well, they're big businesses, right? The Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos. The New York Times, the big TV shows, these are all big companies, right? And so I think they and the people who work for them and their advertisers view the world through a lens of big business. And I also think that what plays very well in today's narratives is conflict. So the media then tends to put workers and business into conflict, and it's big business and workers into conflict. And it just misses this 50% of the economy that is small business. That's a totally different narrative. And Seth and I just wrote a piece about this for an economics magazine. But this idea today, right, you can be a worker for 1 week and then be an owner the next week. I mean, it's really, it doesn't take as much money as it used to get a business off the ground. It does still take time, and you do need to feel kind of the agency and have the resources to take the time to do it. But you can do it for not that much money. And so it's very accessible for a lot of people. But we're not hearing the story of how you can do it pretty easily. We're not hearing the story of how you can do it and be happy. And we're not hearing the story of how important those people are. And they're often pretty heroic people, right? Like you think of the business owners who are working day by day, like in Texas, there was the one furniture store owner who, turned on a dime and opened his furniture stores and turned them into shelters, right? That's the kind of role you see small businesses playing in their communities, but we don't do enough reporting and storytelling about them.
There is a gap. When the first, or they call it the Great Recession, because nobody wanted to use the D word, but in the 2008, 2009, I remember that I got curious about how, since everyone was comparing it to the Depression, I wanted to know, well, who succeeded during the Depression? So I went and did a lot of research on what were the businesses that made it. And it was a lot of ones that began during that time, but they also pivoted. They did what needed to be done to stay around. And the biggest thing that I saw was that they didn't stop on marketing and serving their customers. They continued to serve their customer. They continued to focus on them to keep relationship. Even if people they weren't able to pay for the service, they maybe created a tab with them. They did different things to work out relationally, still staying in business. So when you talk about this idea of it's not as labor, I mean, it is labor intensive, but it's not as capital intensive. Are both of you familiar with the work of Muhammad Yunus? You ever heard that name before?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think he's even maybe referenced in our capital models chapter. Yeah. So the micro lending.
Exactly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about him?
Yeah.
And the idea of, I mean, again, that goes back to the idea of agency, right? Because a lot of what he did was he provided agency to these primarily women, right, who he was loaning to, but he also came up with different models, right? And I think I think that actually what that highlights for us, and we talk about this a little bit, is that there's this belief that there's sort of a formula for lending, right, for giving people money. And oftentimes that formula is just wrong, right? And we talk about some of the new capital models that are really interesting. A couple in particular, these sort of public-private partnerships where basically private money goes into local funding vehicles and it gets matched by either state or federal money, sort of enhances that. And we talk about the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. They only work with companies that already were turned down for bank financing. So the banks have already said these people are not a good credit, but actually their loss ratios are significantly lower than that of banks. And it's lower because they just do a better job of working with the businesses. It's in the vernacular of this part of the community banking and CDFI system. It's called technical assistance. But it's essentially mentorship and help, right? And we talk a lot in the book about the need to connect new builders with mentors and with people who can help, because no one builds a business in a vacuum, right? Everyone needs some assistance. And what the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund really proved is that when you give these very capable people, but who otherwise didn't qualify for a loan, when you give them a little bit of help, they do better, right? These are people that weren't eligible for loans, but yet built businesses that were more successful than the average business because they had a little bit of additional help. And I think that's something that's really important to think about. And that's kind of what Muhammad did in his model too, right? Because he founded these people, borrowed money in these collectives, and these women came together and they helped each other out. And that's essentially the same thing we're talking about.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Do us a favor. If this was useful in any way for you, please go to iTunes and leave us a review. Reviews will allow others to easily discover the podcast. If you'd like more information and to receive a free download, Rediscover Your Destiny, go to ceoofdestiny.com. Thanks again, and tune in next time.